Hello. You know by now that there are 4 types of linguistic variation that people can display. We have phonological variation, lexical variation, syntactic variation, and morphological variation. And these are the ways that we each individually sound different one from another when we speak. And of course, this would apply to writing too, for the most part, except for phonological, because you can't hear someone when they speak. You can't hear someone when they write. Now I'd like to talk about these concepts at a larger level in terms of groups of people and what concepts and terms we need to talk about variation in terms of distinct groups of people using language. In linguistics, we often use the term variety when talking about different types of English. We're talking about internal variety, right? Internal variety meaning within English, not external variety between languages. That's different. There is internal variation within English that allows us to say that some particular types of English sound distinct from one another, but of course they're still the same language because the people can understand each other. Now you may think of these differences in English as a dialect. That's a term we all know. We often avoid using that term in linguistics because it often has negative connotations. If you do a simple search in the news for the term dialect, you'll see it's often used to describe language types, language varieties used by rural people. They'll talk about, country dialect or farmers speaking dialect, or it's used to discuss the language of ethnic minority people or working class people. These are often described as dialects, and it's often negative connotations connotated in that these are described as substandard or as lazy or somehow inferior. For linguists, it's fair to say everyone speaks a dialect. There's English, but none of us just speak English. We all speak a certain variety of English. And so to avoid those negative connotations that are often associated with the word dialect, we just use the term variety. So we might talk about varieties of English at a national level, like Canadian English and British English and Australian English, as well as countries with numerous English native speakers and fluent users, Nigerian English, Indian English, Singaporean English, and so on. We talk about varieties of English sometimes in terms of more local, right? London English, Liverpool English, Birmingham English, Glaswegian English, like that, right? Sometimes even varieties of English are discussed in terms not of where you're from, but in terms of other social variables. Young people's English might be a term you'd hear, and it should draw your mind to the fact that, even though young people from different parts of the world may have different accents, for example, there often are features in their language that seem to be shared in a way that if you were to hear that person talk from his or her language choices, you'd know it was a young person talking, not a child, of course, you'd know from just the pitch of their voice, but a young person, a teenager, perhaps you'd know from the language choices he or she makes that she was in her teens, let's say, despite being from Australia or America or where have you. Language variety is preferred over dialect, although if a linguist does use the term dialect, you should keep in mind it's not being used in any negative way. We're not using it to stigmatize smaller varieties or rural varieties and so on, right? So how do we determine what is a language and what is a variety? The key word, the key phrase to remember is mutual intelligibility. If two language users can speak to one another and understand one another despite differences, then they are mutually intelligible. They understand each other. So if the two varieties are mutually intelligible, we call them the same language, regardless of whether they have some differences. American English and British English, to use the two most well-known examples, are of course mutually intelligible. despite perhaps having some differences, and therefore they're said to be different varieties of English and not two different languages. This is sometimes complicated by the fact that at first you may not understand someone else who's speaking English because you're unfamiliar with some words or some of the phonological variation that they display when they talk, but it doesn't usually take too long to get used to a new accent and to learn some new words. This is also sometimes complicated by political considerations. Sometimes something that linguists consider to be a language is not described by its speakers as being the same language, and vice versa. There are cases like the former country of Yugoslavia, where the speakers were said to speak Serbo-Croatian. When that country separated into various parts, new countries in 1991, the speakers of the people from the country now called Serbia said that they spoke Serbian. The people from the country called Croatia said that they spoke Croatian. So for political reasons, they saw themselves as two different countries, and they therefore said that they spoke two different languages. And the writing systems were different. They used, one uses Cyrillic and the other uses the Latin alphabet. But for linguists of the same language, they are mutually intelligible when they talk. Conversely, for example, in China, the Chinese government often refers to the Chinese language. But for linguists, there are many languages in China that we can't call them all Chinese because they are not mutually intelligible. They may use the same writing system for Mandarin and Cantonese and Hakka and other languages of China. They use the same Chinese characters that you may be familiar with, but the speakers cannot understand each other when they talk, and therefore they're really, for linguists, different languages, despite them sometimes being called Chinese. It's as if they use the same characters but speak differently. It would be as if we said that French and Portuguese and English and German were all the same language because they used the same letters. They're clearly not the same language despite using the same letters for their writing systems. The dialect, think of dialect as existing on or language variety existing on a continuum. We have some varieties here, some here, some here. These people may understand these people more easily. These people may understand these people more easily. As you spread further along, eventually you may reach a point at which the people here and the people way down there cannot understand each other. We would therefore say that those two people are speaking, those two groups are speaking different languages. A useful term to describe these groups of people who speak the same language variety, they have the same features or very similar features phonologically, lexically, and grammatically. You will hear, and we use the term speech community. It's developed by, this term is largely associated with a linguist named Gumpers, and speech community, as you'd guess, means people who are united as a community, communal, together, joined, right, by speech, by the way they use language, by the way they use language in distinct ways to their own group. They have enough similar features with other groups that they are mutually intelligible, but they have enough distinct features that we hear them and we recognize them as being separate from those other groups. Speech community. So you may hear people say things like the young people's speech community, or the medical speech community, the Canadian English speech community, and so on, to draw attention to the fact that those people have linguistic features that unite them as a group. The next major concept I want to talk about for a bit is about how we describe the differences between these groups, not in terms of their linguistic features. You already know how to describe the difference in their linguistic features. different phonology, different lexis, different syntax, different morphology. But language exists at two levels. One is the communicative level. Do you understand someone or not? She's speaking English, she sounds different than me, but I understand her. It's mutually intelligible. We're speaking different varieties of the same language. But language also exists at a social level. When you hear me talk, I'm giving you communicative information. I hope that I'm communicating effectively, but I'm also giving you social information. At the very least, from my accent, I'm telling you that socially I am from a certain place, and perhaps you recognize that I'm not from Britain, and the more you know about accents, you may recognize, well, I'm from North America, and then perhaps you'd know Canada, and you may even know some Canadian regional accents and be able to identify me. So I'm giving you that kind of social information as I talk. I hope I'm also communicating that I think of this topic as very interesting, that I'm treating the topic seriously, right? So I'm not just giving you content about this topic, but also some social information about the way I feel about it and the way I approach it, my attitude to it, and about me as a user of English. But there's another way that we talk about social information in language, and this is related to language and power. We know that there are different varieties of English. For linguists, they are equally communicative. People who speak this variety and that variety can talk to themselves and usually can communicate with other groups. But we know that the different varieties are not socially equal. We know that some varieties, unfairly, are thought of as better than others. We know that some varieties, unfairly, are stigmatized as being weaker socially, even as being weaker intellectually. That the speakers of those varieties are just not smart enough to speak the proper varieties or so-called proper varieties. Standard and non-standard English is the way of describing this. Standard English is typically used by linguists to describe published, written English as used by educated speakers. That's a definition from Peter Trudgill that's quite well known. Standard English is published written English as used by educated speakers. So picture the published written English. Picture newspapers called the Times from around the world. There's the New York Times, there's the Los Angeles Times, there's the Times here in London, there's the Times of India, there's the Straits Times in Southeast Asia. If you were to read these newspapers, you would not really be able to know where they were from just by looking at the English language usage. They're indistinguishable, really. Of course, newspapers from New York will write more about New York and about America, and the Straits Times will write more about Singapore and Hong Kong and so on. So you'd know maybe from the content, but just from the English itself, from the grammatical patterns, from the word choices, you wouldn't know which one was from where. This is standard English. Trudgill used the term standard English, also said educated speakers, as used by educated speakers, but he put educated in scare quotes, single quotes. They're often called scare quotes to warn the reader that you should be scared of this term, scared of taking it at face value. I think with only a bit of thought, you can understand why saying educated speakers is problematic. How educated do you have to be considered a standard English user? Primary, secondary, tertiary education? What type of education does it have to be? Geography, history, mathematics, or do you have to have an English degree in order to be considered an educated user of English? So it is a difficult term to delineate exactly what counts as educated and what doesn't. But there's certainly a general association of standard English with education. And then non-standard English would be anything else. This is, as I said, sometimes problematic to distinguish exactly between the two, but these are terms we hear and terms we need to know in order to talk about language and power, about the social differences between the way people react to different varieties of English. As you know, generally, standard English is thought of as being more socially prestigious than non-standard English. That's fine. Not fair, that's fine in the sense that we have to acknowledge that some varieties of English are thought of as being more socially powerful than others. It's not fair, but it's uncontroversial. Some are and some aren't. The major problem with this is if people extend notions of standard English and its social power to standard English being more intellectually, more of a sign of intellect, right? To think that speakers of non-standard English are not as clever is clearly wrong for everyone, but linguists know this, are sure of this, right? It's no easier to speak a non-standard variety than a standard variety. It takes the same amount of work to use standard language words and standard language grammar as it does to use non-standard language words and non-standard language grammar. I say this because sometimes people say, oh, they speak non-standard English because they're lazy, because they don't know the real words, because they don't know grammar. No, speakers of non-standard varieties clearly use grammatical patterns, so they are clearly following rules. They clearly had to learn some rules. The rules they learned may have been different than the rules for standard English, but it takes just as much work to follow the non-standard rules as the standard rules. Some non-standard English is relatively uncontroversial in the sense that if I say something like Macy and me went to the park, that's, according to the rules of standard English, that's wrong. Macy and me went to the park should be Macy and I went to the park, or Gwen made snacks for Macy and I. People say that a lot. They'll say Macy and I in the object position like that, where according to standard English rules, they really should be saying Gwen made snacks for Macy and me. This is not particularly problematic in that most people wouldn't even pick up on that. It's certainly non-standard because it's not the type of English you'd see in a textbook. Most people wouldn't pick up on it though. What they tend to focus on when discussing non-standard English is non-standard English as used by those same groups that I mentioned earlier when discussing dialect, ethnic minority people, working class people, young people. Groups that are often stigmatized for various reasons are, as you would expect, similarly unfairly stigmatized for their language use. So the final thing to discuss then for now is, well, why do they do it? People who speak non-standard varieties, which are just as much work to speak, just as much effort, cognitive effort is demanded to follow the rules of a non-standard variety. Why do they do it when they know that other people will judge them for it, judge them negatively for the most part? They'll say things like it's non-standard and, you know, at the very least laugh at it. You said in it or something like that. And at worst, they'll think it's a sign of intellectual immaturity or linguistic laziness. Why do people still do this when they know that they are unfairly judged negatively for using non-standard varieties many of the time? The useful concept for discussing this in linguistics terms is to think of the word prestige. Prestige is normally used in the sense of something that is admirable, something that is honorable, something that is desirable. In linguistics, overt prestige and covert prestige are used to discuss standard and non-standard Englishes in a way that allows us to use that word prestige positively for both types. Overt means open, uncovered, visible, like French ouvert. Covert, covered, like under the covers, hidden. Overtly prestigious language is the language of standard English, published, written, used by educated speakers. People who use overt prestige overtly prestigious language can feel good about following the rules of language, can feel good about displaying what society thinks is educated English. That's normal. That's not something that probably you'd already have known that, even if you don't know the term overt prestige. But the interesting thing about the term covert prestige is it allows us to say that, okay, people who speak non-standard varieties know that they're often judged and laughed at for speaking them, but they still do it because it gives them a sense of covert prestige, of hidden prestige, that for them it feels just as good to speak that way as it does for overtly prestigious language speakers to speak standard English. Covert prestige is associated with speaking in a way that signals your membership of a group, especially a localized group, people who are from your neighborhood, people who go to your school, people who look like you. Speaking like them is a sign of membership, of group membership. So covertly prestigious language sounds better to people who use it because it makes them feel part of a group, part of their group. And we can think of it as a sign even of resistance to other externally imposed notions of standard English. In surveys, the English of Birmingham is rated by British people, typically rated by British people as the least favored variety of English. For linguists, remember, it's perfectly communicative. People from Birmingham understand each other just as well as people from anywhere else do. Why do the people of Birmingham keep speaking that way, despite the fact that they know that they're mocked for it? They've heard comedians make stupid jokes about Birmingham accents and so on. They speak that way because, of course, they know people from down the street who are wonderful people. They grew up with mom and dad, whom they love very much. They've got friends, they've got teachers, the doctor over there, the dentist down here, the people who take care of their car, the grocers. They're surrounded by people who speak the same way. And as a sign of group membership with all these good people that they know and resistance to people who make fun of them for speaking that way, they continue to speak the Birmingham variety of English to belong to that speech community and to display that covertly prestigious language that they feel good about. So those are the main things I'd like you to take away from this, thinking about language variety, thinking about language varieties as being mutually intelligible, thinking about speakers of a language variety being part of a speech community, and knowing those terms that we use when we want to discuss the relation between speech communities in terms of social power, and that some are standard and some are non-standard, and that's unfair that the non-standard ones are judged negatively by society, but that there are linguistic ways to describe these differences in a way that acknowledges the power for some of speaking overtly prestigiously and some of speaking covertly prestigiously. Thank you.